this talk is called A Mentor in the Limelight. So who am I? So I got into software by apprenticing at Object Mentor. I was really fortunate that I happened to live in the same town as Uncle Bob Martin. And I was taking some programming classes at my local high school and found this opportunity to apprentice. And what this meant was that I got to go and sweep and do server administration while they were doing these XP immersions. Does anyone know what the XP immersions were? So back in, I think it was like 2001, they had like Michael Feathers, Ron Jeffries, Pascal Roy, Brian Button, like all of these people kind of get up and teach one class about how to do extreme programming. And it was a really humbling experience to learn that pair programming, test-driven development, customer collaboration, this is how you wrote software. So this is actually how I learned to write software. And I apprenticed there for about 5 years before accepting a job. And then went to Eighth Light with Micah Martin. We left Object Mentor to write code rather than teach code. And it has been a really fun experiment so far. And the kind of focus of this talk is the Eighth Light apprenticeship program, kind of the things we learned about teaching, or the things I learned about teaching. And our apprenticeship program is, we have someone come in 3 to 9 months and learn how to write software before they work on any client code. We're a custom contracting firm, so before they write any client code, we do this apprenticeship program. And it's kind of the same thing that I had at Object Mentor, where instead of hiring people and trying to convince them test-driven development is the right thing to do, we'll just go through this immersion and get people, prove it to them that test-driven development is right. And before they have any other practices, we'll just teach them from scratch. And that was kind of the thesis. And it's gone through some iterations, and we've grown the company through this program. So apprenticeship itself is kind of this, really old idea about learning your craft through a period of time. And in software, especially in the Ruby community, we get to get it up and running really fast, right? We get to teach ourselves. And that success is really fortunate that we're able to create at such an early stage in our craft. We also have to remember that there's a lot to learn before we can move too far. So the people we know as masters don't have to devote themselves to a particular skill just to get better at it. The truth is they love to practice. And because of this, they get better. So the apprenticeship and craftsmanship in general is about this idea that you really love to do what you're doing. You're not doing it for the money. You're not doing it as a vehicle for some other outcome, but that you love to write code. And that George Leonard talks a little bit about this mastery curve where skill acquisition comes from you learn a whole bunch at once, and then you plateau for a really long time practicing the things that you're doing. And if you don't absolutely love to write code, those plateaus are going to be unbearable, right? Those times where you're learning intuition and you're practicing. And, so one of the ways that we practice a lot at Eighth Light is katas, where do the prime factors or Roman numeral kata. And the idea is that you take a problem and you focus on the form of the problem rather than solving the problem. So you take the prime factors kata. Everybody, after you've solved it once, you know the solution. But then the next time you approach it, you can go through and try a different recursive technique. Try doing the whole thing without if statements. Try lots of different techniques so that you can get yourself used to writing a for loop, writing recursion, so that when it comes time to write client code, when it comes time to write professionally, you're not thinking about what's the right technique. You already know it in your intuition. And katas are a great way to practice that. And finding a mentor. So the best way to learn something is to learn it from somebody else, somebody who will take responsibility in teaching and keeping you on the right path. There's no need to reinvent the wheel over and over. So what is it that we end up teaching? Well, TDD, I think the biggest mistake you can make is not writing tests. I think it will always cost you money later on, cost you time. Solid, agile, design patterns, this seems all right. I'm sure most people have been exposed to these at some point. Software craftsmanship, collaborating with your customers, productive partnerships, writing well-crafted code, caring about the problems, and Rails. So we end up, after this apprenticeship, most of our work ends up being in Rails. So even though during the apprenticeship you might get to learn lots of cool languages, and it ends up being the client code all in Rails. So we have to, unfortunately or fortunately, teach Rails. So how do you teach Rails? This is the way we started the apprenticeship program. Give them the depot book, or give them the depot problem in the book, and come back a month later and see that completed, or more likely come back in about 20 minutes and say, I can't download Ruby, and have that process go throughout the time. But once they get going, they think Rails is really easy compared to all the other programming challenges they've had. And they're ready to write code. They're ready to write client code. And then the first time they pair on a client story, they realize this is their technology stack. It's not from the depot application, that they have to be proficient in all of these things. So we take a step back and write something that's a breakable toy, something we can fix or something that we can make lots of mistakes on. And 1 week later, and this is in a Rails app, I see this code. And so we just went through teaching every day the solid design principles, some different patterns, command pattern. And then after Googling around and figuring out how to write all of these active record models and using the Rails DSLs, this is what the first solution comes back looking like. And then I ask him, what happened to your single responsibility principle? So it's really easy with all of these DSLs to just throw everything together, and especially if you're creating prototype applications or applications, greenfield apps in their first month. And it's even easier when you're teaching to just say this is okay, right? This is good enough because this small application will be throwaway. So then 1 week later, I see this. And it's well tested, there's a spec, a cucumber saying that they're setting the right tab, that they have a CSS background switch. But then I ask him to go look up, didn't we already talk about model view controller? And in Rails, so if you have an instance variable in a class, you initialize it in the constructor, and then you use it later on in that class, that instance variable belongs to that abstraction, right? So what this is doing, that you're setting an instance variable in the controller, and you're using it in the view, right? So that's the same thing. So without carefully defined interfaces, those instance variables make the controller and the view the same thing. So things like this will break down the model view controller, which Rails sets some kind of model view controller framework for you. And then another week later, I see code like this. These after creates, after saves, before creates. after, before, every possible thing in just a stack of them in the top of my active record model, and then 30 private methods that support them. And I say, why didn't you use the observer pattern? And when you use the observer pattern, the subject and the concrete observer are two separate items, and there's a reason that we do that. And Rails actually, if you dig in a little bit deeper, lets you do that by implementing the observer interface. It lets you abstract what the behavior you're doing in these hooks. So then why all the fuss? Well, the fuss is once you start writing client code, if you follow all of these Rails frameworks, these DSLs, without a skeptic's eye, you end up with these enormous classes that are very difficult to maintain. And you end up throwing all of these design principles that you spent your apprenticeship learning, and they're just completely thrown out the window. So the design principles are one thing, but then what do these DSLs also show us? Is they, well, I guess a better question is when I see this line of code, I ask, well, what does this actually do? Right? It seems pretty straightforward. It validates that some name field on a project is both present and unique. So does that guarantee that it's present and unique? What is this actually doing? If you have two, if you have it run through this code in memory twice, is this guaranteeing it as a constraint to the database? And usually those are the kinds of things that you really have to know, especially when you're building, a lot of our clients' applications are enormous and they have to be scaled, and you have to understand exactly what this is doing. Is this checking, is this guaranteeing you uniqueness? Well, it's not. And things like this, where it's really easy to get going in these DSLs, but do you know what this is doing? Why would you use put versus post versus get? So the problem with teaching Rails and starting a craftsman off early in their career with Rails is that we don't learn the details first. And so when we learn how to write those SQL queries, hopefully an ORM will abstract that from us, but we still have to know exactly what that's doing. And Rails makes it sometimes a little bit too easy, and you only figure it out when you're going the other way, when the abstraction has broken and a web app is down and you have to figure out what's going on, or when some query is not taking, or is taking a really long time, is it loading up this entire object graph? Rails didn't tell you that it was going to load up all these dependencies. So it's these vertical skills, learning SQL through first and then the ORM model, and then designing the business layer on top of that. And teaching these vertical skills is sometimes very difficult through Rails. So this talk is about returning to a simpler place, a playground for practicing these design principles. And early on we used a lot of Sinatra, and something that's real kind of simple lets you design. And this is about Limelight. So Limelight is kind of that place where you can teach these and design principles and play around with them without having to know some of those details yet. So getting an architecture sense and a design sense and a testing sense before you have to know what jQuery is, before you have to know what SQL statements are. So, I mean, jumping into a new project, you have an MVC framework in Rails, and maybe you have an MVC framework in JavaScript, and learning all of these things at the same time can be a little bit difficult. So what is Limelight? It's a rich client GUI framework written entirely in Ruby. It's got this interesting theater metaphor where you have a production, and each production will have stages and scenes and props and actors. And so it's a coherent metaphor to talk about the framework itself rather than overloading terms like view or controller or helper in Rails, where is model view controller in Rails exactly like model view controller or model view presenter that you were taught in a textbook? It's an interpretation of it, right? So what Limelight does is it lets you build the model view controller framework for your application instead of kind of putting that on top. So it's a blank slate. Lets you exercise your design principles. For instance, an observer. So the first observer that you write, in Ruby, how do you write an observer? This is one possible implementation using registered blocks, right? So it doesn't have to be that the exact way from the UML diagram that I showed earlier. Like, there's lots of different interpretations of an observer. And when you go through, this is one that was written to do Limelight actions. And when you're teaching and you go through, write a command pattern, write an observer, and you have no place to start, no DSL on top of it, it ends up looking a lot like that UML abstraction diagram. So embracing the framework with a skeptic's eye. So that's the short version of it, and now we have, I don't know who came in late, but we're going to do an exercise in Limelight.